Morning. Now, if you're not familiar with the story of Israel's exodus out of Egypt, or if you maybe need a refresher, let me give you a quick recap. The Hebrew people, who we see in the book of Genesis, who are thriving as the nation of Israel, by the time we reach the second book of the Bible in Exodus, things have changed dramatically for them, because a new Pharaoh comes to power in Egypt. He sees how many Israelites there are, how many Hebrew people. He becomes intimidated by them. He says, they're too powerful. There are too many of them. They're too powerful. If they went to war with us, we'd be destroyed. If they sided with our enemies, we would be destroyed. We'd be toast. So the Pharaoh says, here's what I'll do. I'll enslave them. So in enslaving them, he seeks to get power over them. He treats the Israelites harshly. He beats them. He starves them. He treats these people as slaves, and it's awful. Well, God raises up a leader, Moses, who speaks as God's mouthpiece to go to the Pharaoh and say, let my people go. He demands, let my people go. And the Pharaoh says, no, I'm not going to let them go. They're too good of workers. So God sends plagues. Moses keeps on going back to Pharaoh, let my people go. No, okay, God sends more plagues. Eventually, after all of this, the Pharaoh says, okay, I've had enough of the plagues. You can take your people and your plagues and get out of here. So God sends Moses and the people, and they leave Egypt. God tells them, before you go, ask your neighbors for gold jewelry to take with you. So even as God's people are sent out of their captivity, they get this gold that they'll take with them. We'll mention that again later. So they get out. They're on their way out. And the Pharaoh decides, you know what? I go back on it. I do want these people. So he sends an army. Moses, used by God, parts the Red Sea. God's people pass through on dry land with the ocean wall on either side of them. God sends the water back over to drown Pharaoh's army that's coming after them. So there's this great miracle that happens. There's so many of those where God does miracle after miracle to show his mighty power, to rescue his people out of captivity. And yet, after all of that, after he appears as a pillar of flame to guide them by night, he parts the water, he gives them food from heaven, he does all of these great things that can only be ascribed to God. Despite all of that, God's people complain. They gripe. They rebel against God. The God who saved them, the only one who's really taken care of them, and yet they rebel against him. They complain. So because of that, their fate is to wander for 40 years in the desert. Instead of going straight to the promised land where they'll make their home, they have to wander for 40 years in the desert. Which brings us to today's story. I hope we're all caught up now. So you can call this story this morning an UnThanksgiving dinner, or the craved grave, whichever title you prefer. So our story opens up in the desert. It's early morning, the time that the dew would be settling on the grass if there was much grass, but there's not a lot of that because it's the desert. But instead, on the desert floor, there's all these things that look like seeds. They have the color of tree resin. They look a little bit like, it's called coriander seeds. That's just covering the desert floor. And this happens every day. Because you see, this is food that God delivers from heaven. When the Israelites first see it, they look at it and go, what is this? And in Hebrew, what is this is manna. So that's what they call it, manna. That's their daily bread, so to speak, is this thing called manna. If we look at Numbers 11, 7 through 8, we read a little bit more about what exactly it was like. We have a lot of detail, actually, about what the manna was like. But you could do different things with it. You could cook it in different ways. And think about some of the stuff that we have today, like quinoa and all that kind of stuff. You do all kinds of things with it. So it was kind of a preference thing. You could grind it up. You could put it into little cakes. It makes it into the Psalms. In Psalm 78:24, we read that it is bread from heaven. And it's referred to by some as angel food. So I know I think about angel food cake when I hear those cakes. It's angel food, it's angel food cake. But I tend to think it's probably even better. It's probably sweeter and it's in abundance. So if we read in Numbers 11, starting with verse 7, we get a little bit of details about this, and this should be in your notes. The manna was like coriander seed and looked like resin. The people went around gathering it. and then ground it in a hand mill or crushed it in a mortar. They cooked it in a pot or made it into loaves, and it tasted like something made with olive oil. When the dew settled on the camp at night, the manna also came down. So God is literally sending food from heaven, and it tastes sweet, and it makes it into cakes. And the way that God distributes this food is really interesting, because he sends it out to cover the desert floor, and they collect it up, and it's exactly enough for exactly every person, exactly every family, for exactly enough for that day. So you would gather up what you needed. It was just enough. It wasn't too little. It wasn't too much. It was just enough. Now, you could, if you were to gather more, if you were trying to be greedy and you were going to say, I'm going to save leftovers for the next day, it would disintegrate. So there was no keeping leftovers. Again, there's no refrigeration. But God did another miracle, because on the Sabbath day, you can't collect this. So God would say, okay, the day before the Sabbath, every week, you can collect double the amount. You can collect enough to have leftovers for the Sabbath day. And miraculously, on that day, the leftovers didn't disintegrate. So God does a miracle in the way that he sends the food. Not only is the food a miracle, but in the way that he does it, in the exactness of it. So Israel is constantly at the grace and mercy of God for their daily bread. It's very clear they cannot do this on their own. Every meal that they have is literally given to them by God just in that moment, just what they need, nothing more. So if we look at this story of the manna, it was a very popular story for the Hebrew people, and we see it come up again in the New Testament. Jesus tells us when we pray to God the Father, give us this day our daily bread. And it's kind of a call back to this story, because we pray that we'll have enough sustenance each day, and God gives that to us each day. We think, oh, I've got plenty of food at home, I've got enough sustenance to last me. Many of us are one disaster away from being in a really hard time. We really are relying upon God day by day, whether we know it or not. Jesus also tells us, why worry about what we will eat? Consider the birds of the air. They have plenty to eat. If God will take care of the sparrow, if his eye is on the sparrow, he will also take care of you. So the people are fully reliant upon God to escape from slavery. He appears to them at night as a pillar to guide them on their way. They're fully dependent on him for every meal that they get, that they miraculously get, and all of these details of how they get their meals. So you would think that because of all these miraculous things that God has been doing, that the people would be eternally grateful and visibly aware of their dependence upon God. You would think they would feel that way. You would think that they would be overflowing with gratitude for all that God has done in their past and what he continues to do every morning. His mercies are new. You would think that would resonate with them. You would think. But let's look at what happens in Numbers chapter 11, starting with verse 4. The rabble with them began to crave other food. And again, the Israelites started wailing and said, if only we had meat to eat. Now let's stop right there in just that verse and let's talk about this for a minute. The rabble that this verse is referring to is a group that's referred to in the first 3 verses of this chapter as the mixed multitude. And what it was there was a group of people that were traveling with Israel. They were not Israelites. They were not the Hebrew people. They were not the people of God. They traveled alongside of the Israelites in their journeys. So you have the inner circle, the camp of God's people. On the outer perimeter, you have the fringe of the camp. That's where kind of the outsiders were. And so in the first 3 verses of this chapter, we see this rebellion that starts up among the mixed multitude, the rabble. They kind of start an argument, a kind of sort of rebellion amongst themselves. The Israelites are not really involved, but they start a rebellion amongst themselves in the first 3 verses. So there's already been a rebellion. And there's fire. God sends fire throughout the camp. And it only burns part of the camp. It only burns those who are starting the rebellion in this mixed multitude. So we see that in the first 3 verses. So already the outsiders have started trying to rebel against God. God sends a fire. Very next verse, verse 4, is starting again. It's the same group of people. But this time, it's not just amongst themselves. It's not just We amongst ourselves have decided to rebel, and now they're involving the Israelites on the rebellion. So, I love what a lot of commentators said about this. I saw this in different places, that the rabble, the mixed multitude, is also translated by some people as the riffraff, which I love. The riffraff has come in and started trouble. See, the people on the fringe have started a revolt. The riffraff has started a revolt. The people on the inside, the center of the camp, God's people, they've started listening to the lies. They've started believing the lies of the people outside of the faith, outside of the chosen people. They've started to listen to the lies. They've started to believe them. And they're behaving in different ways based on the lies that they're buying from people outside of the people of God. Now, isn't that what happens? Forces from outside of your family. Someone says something, something does something, and then voices from outside of your family can impact your family. So brothers and sisters can turn on each other. Marriages can end in divorce. A safe home can turn into a fearful home. By forces on the outside, home should be a safe place, but sometimes things on the outside affect us, unfortunately. It happens in churches. As a church, we want to be relevant. We want to seek new and creative ways, and we should be creative. We should find new ways, but sometimes a church trying to reach out into the world can become too much like the world. And I want to show you a brief clip of a time that was attempted in 2014.
The priest gives you a communion wafer, then a sip of wine, then asks, would you like fries with that? The situation sounds insane, but if one group's crowdfunding campaign is successful, it could become a reality. A group of 3 friends calling themselves the McMass Project has launched an Indiegogo page trying to raise $1 million to build a McDonald's franchise in a church, possibly in New Jersey or the Philadelphia area. Is this a joke? No, vows Paul DeLuca, one of the multi-denominational group's members. Christianity is unable to capture modern audiences, he argues, and as the project's website states, McDonald's restaurants bring communities together. A McDonald's representative could not be reached for comment.
So, it's just one of many examples where, and again, going back to family and in the church, there's forces, we've all been affected, I think, by forces on the outside who have impacted our families. We say or we do something, we say, where did that come from? That didn't come from me. That come from the outside, that come from the enemy outside of the camp. In the church, we can try so hard to reach other people that we become a little bit too much like the world that we're trying to reach. So none of us are exempt. We've all been affected. Brother against sister, husband against wife, churches losing their calling from God and becoming a little bit too much like a McDonald's. We've all been affected. So I think we all can relate to that riffraff that comes in our midst, the enemy who's stirring up trouble in the camp. This enemy, this outer fringe, has gotten underneath the Hebrew people's skin. They got the nation of Israel to take up their own complaints. Israel didn't have this complaint so much until the outer fringe, the outsiders, start to bring it in to them. They start to take on that complaint from the outsiders as their own. Now that's something they're telling themselves. They want meat. Some of you might remember the old Wendy's commercial where the lady says, "Where's the beef?" That's what they're saying to themselves. Where's the beef? Where's the meat? We've got this food from heaven. Yeah, we're tired of that. Where's the beef? Now, look what happens next in verses 5 through 6. And folks, I know that these next 2 verses are serious, but I cannot help but laugh every time I see these 2 verses because I have to laugh at the ridiculousness of this all. I want you to just think about the people of Israel who are captive slaves and they were beaten and starved. What do they say when they reflect back on their time of slavery in verses 5 through 6? We remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost. Also the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. But now we have lost our appetite. We never see anything but this manna. So I want you to think about the exaggerated menu that they're talking about. They were slaves, they were treated poorly, but to hear them tell it, do you remember back when we had the best of room service? But they'd bring in the buffet cart with the filet mignon and all the vegetables and the desserts, and they would pile high. It was an all-you-can-eat buffet, and it cost us nothing. Slavery was great. I'm sure this was not the conditions that they really lived in, but to hear them tell it, they were idealizing the past. Sometimes our memories can deceive us. Can anybody relate to that? Have you ever had a time where you were in an unhealthy situation and God pulled you out of that unhealthy situation, and then sometimes you look back and say, I kind of miss it. I kind of miss it back there. And even though I know it wasn't good for me, I kind of miss being back there. Imagine if you used to dumpster dive for food, and then someone said, I want to give you cake every day. And you eat some cake for a while, and they find you dumpster diving back again. Say, what are you doing? I gave you cake. Yeah, but I had to go back in the dumpster because there was so much variety in the dumpster. That's what Israel is doing. It's like, we want variety, but I gave you cake from heaven. Angel food, it fell on the yeah, but we want variety. Now, remember we said God has been providing delicious food from heaven. It's just exactly enough, and the people are to rely fully upon God for their sustenance, their daily bread. But not only are they sick of bread, they seem to be sick of relying upon God. We see that not only are they sick of bread, but Israel has a tendency to say, we really don't want to rely upon anybody for our sustenance. We don't want to rely upon God for our next meal. We want to just do this under our own power, which how many times has that worked for Israel? How many times has it worked for us? It doesn't really tend to work for us. We might think we are relying upon our own power. We got ourselves here, but we'd be lying to ourselves. So this is the first time that Israel has rebelled. Shortly before this story, we had in Exodus 32, a famous story. You remember we mentioned at the beginning the gold jewelry that they took from their neighbors when they left Egypt. Well, in Exodus 32, they take all that gold jewelry. They should have done something for God with that, or should have used it to barter with, to get resources, supplies that they need on the road to the Promised Land. But no, they at Exodus 32, when God is on the mountain speaking to Moses, and there is smoke and flame, and the earth shakes at the sound of his voice. Despite all of that going on in the mountain, down at the base of the mountain, in Exodus 32, they say, Moses has been gone for a long time. I think he's dead. Well, obviously the mountain's shaking, something's going on. But we think maybe Moses is dead. Why don't we start a new revolution? Let's take all that jewelry, let's melt it down, let's make a golden calf. We're going to worship that, which is a slap in the face of God. They're taking literally the gifts of God and melting them down to worship a false god they made with their own hands. And it's ridiculous. If this was a school cafeteria, Israel's trying to trade their lunch for somebody else's lunch. Anybody else's lunch will do. I don't care if it came out of the dumpster. Just anybody else's lunch will do. It's got to be better than what God gave me. Now, there's actually two stories in this chapter in Numbers 11. We're only going to talk about one. But there is another story going on at the same time where God teaches Moses a lesson about delegating leadership. And so there are 70 elders appointed, and God sends his spirit over them. And the lesson in that chapter is that God doesn't just send his spirit on Moses, the leader, he sent it on a lot of people, and they share the responsibility of doing the ministry for God's people. So there is a great story in that. We can talk about that some other time. We want to just focus in on this story. So I just want to explain why we're skipping a few verses, because we'll share that other story at a later time. But in verse 10, God and Moses both are listening to this complaining, this whining that's going on in the camp. So for those of you who have raised children, don't you hate whining? I hate whining. Well, everybody is sitting outside of their tent whining, and it sounds a little like this. Now imagine that going on 1,000-fold. Everybody's sitting outside with that annoying, obnoxious whining outside of their tent. And you wouldn't blame Moses if he said, God, I can't even, just wipe them out. But Moses keeps on defending the people. Let's look at his conversation with God in verse 18. Let's see what God says in response to all this whining. People are saying, we want meat. They're whining for it. Verse 18. Tell the people, consecrate yourselves in preparation for tomorrow when you will eat meat. The Lord heard you when you wailed, if only we had meat to eat. We were better off in Egypt. Now the Lord will give you meat, and you will eat it. You will not eat it for just 1 day or 2 days or 5, 10, or 20 days, but for a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils and you loathe it, because you have rejected the Lord who is among you, and have wailed before him, saying, why did we ever leave Egypt? But Moses said, here I am among 600,000 men on foot, and you say, I will give them meat to eat for a whole month? Would they have enough if flocks and herds were slaughtered for them? Would they have enough if all the fish in the sea were caught for them? The Lord answered Moses, is the Lord's arm too short? Now you will see whether or not what I say will come true for you. So be careful what you wish for. See, this chapter answers the question, what happens when I tell God how to bless me? What happens when I make demands of God? I say, God, you're not blessing me right. Let me tell you how to do it. Let me set out the blueprint, the checklist. God, you got to do it this way. What happens when we make demands of God? See, it's okay to ask God for things. It's okay to say, God, I want to pray to you for this. It's okay to ask God for things. But to demand, to just say, God doesn't know what he's doing. God had a plan, but he missed some spaces. Don't worry, I'll fill them in. To make demands of God is a different thing. To suggest that they would be better off if they were still captive in Egypt, enslaved, being beaten and hungry, to suggest that God didn't know what he was doing in saving them. And God doesn't know what he's doing now with them. To suggest that, that's a different thing than just praying to God. So there must be a reason, isn't there, why God hasn't given them meat yet. There must be some kind of reason. Granted, if they slaughtered their flocks, they would lose the livelihood they get out of the flocks, all the other things they get besides just meat. And Moses even said just a moment ago, even if they slaughtered all the flocks, it wouldn't be enough to feed them. So there has to be some other source for meat. So they want another source, and there must be some reason why God hasn't given it to them. Could it be that God knows what he's doing? Could it be that God has a purpose beyond what Israel can see? I think he just might. So why don't we look at verse 31. Now a wind went out from the Lord and drove quail in from the sea. It scattered them up to 2 cubits deep all around the camp, as far as a day's walk in any direction. All that day and night and all the next day the people went out and gathered quail. No one gathered less than 10 homers. Then they spread them out all around the camp. But while the meat was still between their teeth and before it could be consumed, the anger of the Lord burned against the people, and he struck them with a severe plague. Therefore the place was named Kibroth Hattaavah, because there they buried the people who had craved other food. Now there's a lot of interesting things going on in this passage. So a wind goes forth from the Lord. Now, I did say we're not going to tell the other story in this chapter, but I do need to reference it because there's a point to be made here. God appoints 70 elders to help Moses. In the middle of all this, he says, I can't do this by myself. God says, you're right. I'm going to have some people help you. So in that story, found in the same chapter, God sends out a wind over the elders, and they start to prophesy. Now, the Hebrew word for wind there is ruach, which can mean wind, and it can mean spirit. So God sends out his Spirit among the people. We think about in the New Testament, after the book of Acts, the Holy Spirit. God didn't send out the Holy Spirit on all believers in the Old Testament, but he did send it out on some for a select period of time. So God sends out his Spirit on these elders. So that's a good story. It has a positive ending. God has sent his Spirit out on the elders. They're going to do ministry along with Moses. Moses is not the only one to hear from God. So that's a positive story. But in this story, God sends out a wind, and it's not a positive story, but it looks like one. It looks like a positive story because God sends out a wind, and all of these quail show up. So it looks like what they need, but it's not what they need, it's what they want. It's not what they need. It's what they want, it's not what God wants them to have. But he's given them what they asked for. He has sent out a wind, and these quail come in. Now it's estimated that the quail would have flown about 3 feet high. And when we translate out how many cubits there was, we find that the Bible is telling us that they're about 3 feet high of quail. And they're stacked, they're going to be stacked on top of each other. And it's as far as you can walk in any direction. So if they're stacked on top of each other, they're stacked tight, they're not moving much, and they're not moving very efficiently. So you can just walk out there and you can just scoop up some quail. I don't know how the hunting was, but if they're this high all around, it's probably pretty easy. So I look at that story of all these quail and I say, well, how exactly did they kill them? And why aren't the quail moving? Why aren't they leaving that place? When you see the first Israelite run out into the camp and start scooping up quail, why don't the other quail say, hey, let's get out of here? Why aren't they moving? Now, it could be that God commands the quail to stay still. Possible. But it seems a little odd. So they keep on piling up all of these quail. I don't know how many of you ever trick-or-treated with a pillowcase, but you put a lot of candy in a pillowcase, right? Imagine they're scooping up the quail in their pillowcase. They've got their buffet plate full, and they're going back with a to-go box, and they're just piling up more and more quail. So fires are being prepared. They're lighting up the grill. They're getting ready. They got out their finest china. Granted, it wasn't called china back then, but their finest plates, whatever those were. They take their first bite, and while the first bite is still in their mouth, before they swallow it, before they can finish their plate, they die. They don't even really get to enjoy the meal they so desperately asked for, demanded, rather. Now, this wasn't the entirety of God's people, but it was a significant portion, and they were buried in this place called Kibroth Hattaavah, which means graves of craving. There's almost a wordplay in there. Graves of craving. So this is where their ungodly cravings came to die. So in Psalm 106, we read about this. In verse 6, we have sinned, even as our ancestors did. We have done wrong and acted wickedly. When our ancestors were in Egypt, they gave no thought to your miracles. They did not remember your many kindnesses, and they rebelled by the sea, the Red Sea. Yet he saved them for his name's sake, to make his mighty power known. He rebuked the Red Sea, and it dried up. He led them through the depths as through a desert. He saved them from the hand of the foe, from the hand of the enemy he redeemed them. The waters covered their adversaries. Not one of them survived. Then they believed his promises and sang his praise. But they soon forgot what he had done and did not wait for his plan to unfold. In the desert they gave in to their craving. In the wilderness they put God to the test. So he gave them what they asked for, but sent a wasting disease among them. Now there's some speculation that we have. Many years after the fact, some scholars and scientists have looked at this story. There's some speculation about that there might be something going on with the quail. That the meat that the Hebrew people so desperately craved, that they demanded, they gathered up, there was something wrong with it. See, those quail may have fattened themselves on a particular type of plant. I may be mispronouncing this, a hellebore family of plants. I think it's on the screen here, yes. So those plants are not toxic to quail. Quail can eat them, but if you eat quail that have eaten of the hellebore family of plants, it can be toxic to you. And it can have varying levels of toxicity depending on you and your biological makeup, how that's going to affect you. It could be, I got a little sick, or it could be, I could die. If people plant this in their gardens, you have to wear gloves because if you run up against it, it can be irritant to your skin. The Greeks and the Romans from ancient times, they have numerous records from the same time period, the same thing that happened to other people, that they ate quail who ate of the hellebore family of plants. And there was a condition called cauternism, where it breaks down your muscle cells. So you eat of this, and it starts to break down your muscle cells. It can cause convulsions, it can cause vertigo, and the ancient Jewish historian Philo says of this story that the people, as they were eating it, died throwing up. They threw up their bile. So when God says, I'm going to give you meat, I'm going to give you so much meat that it comes out of your nose. Yeah, that's a literal thing. It really did. So it sure sounds like God was looking out for his people and denying them meat. He was protecting them from something they didn't know. They didn't know that the quail may have been poisonous. And we don't really know that that's exactly the way that God sent a plague to them, but it sure sounds like that could have been a way that God was doing that. In either case, whether he used this condition or something else, it becomes clear that God was protecting his people from things they didn't know about, from things they thought they wanted, they thought they craved, but if they had only known, they'd say, no, we don't need to go there. The judgment of God, in this case, was to give people exactly what they asked for. He gave people the freedom to choose either God's way or another more harmful way, but they had the freedom to choose. He didn't force them to make the right decision. They had the freedom to scoop up all the quail and at the same time scoop up all of the consequences. Now, have you ever bitten off more than you can chew? Have you ever gotten exactly what you asked for and you've had buyer's remorse after that? Say, oh, I wish I didn't get this after all. Have you ever fought God to get your way? You fought God against something and then you got your way, only to find out you made a terrible mistake. So we asked a question earlier. What does it look like when I try and force God to bless me in the way that I see fit and not how he sees fit? Well, in this instance, in this story, and also in our own lives, if we won't listen to God's warning on a matter, sometimes he allows us to see for ourselves why we were wrong, why he was right. Sometimes he allows us to see for ourselves. He would rather us learn the easy way, to just trust him and obey him, just listening. But sometimes we have to learn the hard way. I wonder how many of you can say, yeah, sometimes I have to learn the hard way too. Sometimes we're just too worried about meeting our cravings and our desires, and we confuse them for needs. When they're really just cravings and desires, it's not really what we need. You say, I need this or I need that, and I'll do anything to get it. I'll even go around God's plans. I'll circumvent God, because he doesn't know I need this. He's overlooked this part in his plan. But no worries. I'll supplement it. I'll fill it in. Or maybe, I know he told me no, but that can't be right. Doesn't he know that I need some of that quail over there? It's a good, fat, and juicy quail. Look at it. It looks so appealing, and I bet it's been fattening itself up on all kinds of plants. So we ask God. We petition God in prayer. Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes the answer is no. And sometimes the answer is wait. But once we've given over our request to God, it's in his hands. It's not in our hands. He may ask us to do something. He may ask us to fulfill part of the plan, to do something, but it's his orders that we follow. It's not our orders. Once we give it over to God, it's not us to decide exactly how this is going to happen. It's for us to listen to God and follow his commands on what's going to happen next. Do you know how ridiculous it is to ask God to work out something for you and then to go around him to try to work it out your own way? Would you tell a painter to paint your house and then push them aside and start coloring the walls with crayons? That would be ridiculous, right? Would you hire an electrician to install some lighting in your house and then lock them out of the house so they can't get in so that you can put battery-powered lanterns in every room? That would be ridiculous. So we've got the professional, we've got God, the one who knows how to give us the things that we need and to do things that we don't know how to do. Someone who sees the big picture in a way that we can't, and we push him aside to try and do things our way. We end up wanting. We end up hurt. The master chef is in the kitchen. He's serving up angel food cake. And we're making shish kebab out of poison quail. So my question to you this morning is, what is your poison quail this morning? What are you scooping up that God has told you is not healthy for you, that's not good for you? Are you rejecting the blessings of God and then instead you're grabbing vials of poison? What do you need to leave at the altar this morning? If I said to you, I'm going to take all of my ungodliness, all of my ugliness, all my insecurities, all of my sins, and I'm going to dump them at your feet, you'd say I'm crazy. Say, I don't want those. I don't want all of your nastiness, all of your bad stuff. I don't want you to dump that at my feet. And yet, Jesus accepts them. He died on the cross, and he expects us to take all of those bad things within us and to put those down at his feet. It's not a worthy sacrifice. It pales in comparison to what he did on the cross. But he expects us to take all that ugliness inside and to give that up to him. He expects us to take our poison quail and instead of consuming it, to say, here you go, I don't need this. I know it's not what you want me to have. To give it up to him, to put it down at his feet, at the feet of the cross. If you ever broke anything as a kid, and I'm remembering one of my own little stories here, if you ever broke anything as a kid, you might have tried to fix it up. You might have tried to hide it. You might have tried to duct tape it or glue it. I know some of you probably are remembering, yeah, I did that. You might have tried to hide something that you broke. When you really could have just told your parents, you could have fessed up and said, hey, I broke this. And it could have been fixed the right way. Now that you put duct tape and glue all over it, it may have made it worse. And similarly, we can't fix ourselves. We can try to hide it from God and say, I'm going to put some glue on it, I'm going to put some tape on it, and we try to patch it up, and it'll be a poor substitute. And God doesn't expect us to fix ourselves. God expects us to come to Him and say, I can't do that. I have these broken pieces. What am I supposed to do with this? And God takes them and puts them together and makes us whole, makes us something that He can fill with His glory. This morning, as we sing our final hymn, won't you please come forward and to give up those things that you've demanded from God that you don't really need. You can kneel and pray at the altar. You can talk with me. I always turn off my microphone. I'm always concerned that someone's going to come up and talk to me and think that my mic's hot and they're going to share their deepest, darkest secret in the microphone. I turn off the microphone. I'd love to talk with you this morning, either here or at the door as we leave, or we can talk sometime this week if you want to talk more in depth. I'd love to do that. Perhaps you'd like to join this church. I think we all have heard lies on the outer fringe of the camp, and it's gotten into every domain of our lives. Our families, it can affect us in the way that we worship God. It can affect us in our workplace. It can affect us in every way as we listen to the lies on the outer fringe of the camp and start to believe those as our own truth, when it's really not even in keeping with the faith that we have in Christ. But instead of listening to the outer fringe of the camp, why not come in closer into the camp? Hopefully closer into the center of God's will. Why not join the church? Why not join the church? This family of faith. We're not perfect. We all buy the lies on the outside of the camp sometimes, but we're all a family of God. Why not become part of the family? Everyone is welcome. Won't you please come forward as we sing this, our final